Let's begin here because too many mistake loneliness for failure. A person without friends is often judged as incomplete, as if their worth depended on the number of people gathered around them. We live in a world that prizes connections, numbers, and constant interaction. But what happens when someone has none of these? The truth is rarely spoken. Having no friends does not always mean being unworthy, unloved, or broken. Often, it reveals something deeper, something stirring within the soul. It is not a punishment, but a symbol, an opening into the hidden story of the inner self. And it is in this silence that a person may begin to hear the voice of their own being. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Many assume friendship is a simple social fact. You either have people around you or you don't. But Jung reminded us that what happens outwardly mirrors what lives within. The lack of external bonds is often a reflection of invisible movements of the psyche. It is a message written not in words, but in symbols. For some, the absence of friends grows from old wounds never healed. For others, it comes from a sensitivity that feels overwhelmed by noise, small talk, and surface exchanges. And for a few, it marks a deeper search, a turning away from distraction to move closer to what is essential. The world calls this emptiness. Yet from a psychological view, it is not emptiness at all. It is a space where the unconscious speaks. Solitude becomes a mirror showing not only fears and losses, but hidden capacities waiting to emerge. Loneliness, then, and is not a random condition. It is a signal asking us to pause to recognize what we have forgotten about ourselves. Think of it this way. Society measures value by visibility, by how many companions walk beside us. But the soul measures differently. It values truth, even if truth demands a season of silence. The absence of friends may feel heavy, but it also clears a path that leads inward to the most important relationship of all, the friendship with oneself. This is where our exploration begins, not with judgment, but with curiosity, not with shame, but with recognition that what looks like lack is often the very threshold of awakening. In Jung's words, loneliness is not the absence of people, but the inability to share what matters most. And so to walk through this opening is to face the inner world where shadow longing and hidden strength wait to be seen. When we look closer at why someone ends up alone, we rarely find chance. Beneath the surface of solitude, there are often hidden roots planted long ago. Childhood is where many of these roots first take hold. A child who is unseen, who is silenced or brushed aside, begins to believe that her feelings have no value. In silence, this belief takes shape, and over time, it becomes the lens through which she sees every human connection. What begins as a small wound deepens across the years. The little boy laughed at for speaking his mind becomes the man who holds back his truth. The girl who was excluded at the playground grows into a woman who hesitates to reach out, fearing rejection before it even comes. The psyche remembers what the conscious mind tries to forget. To protect itself, it builds walls that later appear as isolation. Rejection leaves marks we do not always see. A child who once felt mocked or abandoned learns to withdraw before the pain repeats itself. Solitude becomes safer than closeness. The soul whispers if others cannot be trusted better to stay apart. And so the fracture appears not as weakness, but as a shield woven from old pain. Jung often reminded us that the unconscious does not speak in words. It speaks in patterns, habits, and defenses that silently shape our choices. What looks from the outside like antisocial behavior is often the unconscious trying to preserve the fragile self. The person avoids company not because she despises others, but because deep within she fears the return of wounds too raw to face again. This protective distance can last for years. On the surface, she may appear reserved, quiet, or indifferent. Yet underneath, there is often a longing to connect. The fracture is not the absence of desire, but the conflict between yearning and fear. Loneliness grows heavy not because she doesn't care, but because she cares too much. Each rejection reopens the old scar, reminding her of her unworthiness. At the same time, another path leads into solitude. Some withdraw, not from rejection, but from overstimulation. The noise of the modern world overwhelms those with sensitive inner lives. They cannot thrive in endless chatter or shallow bonds. Their nervous system craves silence. Their soul seeks depth. In this case, solitude becomes a choice not to escape, but to preserve what is essential. Society often calls this weakness. It labels the withdrawn person as awkward, distant, or antisocial. Yet what if this separation is not failure, but fidelity to a deeper rhythm? Jung would say that the person cannot force herself into the mold of constant companionship without betraying something vital inside. She does not fit easily into the marketplace of quick friendships because her inner life demands something more enduring. The fracture here is not only personal, it is cultural. The modern world rewards speed, surface, and constant connection. But the soul is older than society, and it longs for truth. When a person refuses the trivial and turns away from shallow bonds, she is often accused of being strange or unfriendly. But beneath that refusal lies the hunger for authenticity. And so we see two paths that converge: the path of wounded withdrawal and the path of conscious separation. Both leave a person standing apart. Both appear from the outside as having no friends. Yet each contains a hidden meaning. The first shields the psyche from more pain. The second shields the soul from emptiness. Loneliness, then, is not a flat surface, but a landscape with many layers. On one level lies the wound of rejection. On another lies the need for silence. Together, they form the first fracture, where the person begins to live at a distance. She does not fully belong to the crowd, and she knows it. This distance becomes the opening scene in a deeper psychological story. The absence of friends is not just the absence of people. It is the presence of an invisible wall. A wall built from pain, fear, or longing for depth. And though it protects, it also imprisons. For in keeping out the danger of others, it also keeps out their warmth. In this paradox, the fracture of solitude takes its most painful form. the yearning to connect alongside the inability to do so. At this point, the person feels torn. She may watch others laugh together, yet cannot step into their circle. She may crave intimacy, yet push it away. She may even tell herself she prefers to be alone while secretly mourning the bonds she never dared to claim. It is here, at this painful intersection of longing and fear, that the unconscious begins its deeper work. For the unconscious is not content to leave the wound untouched. It pushes gently, sometimes harshly, toward recognition. Dreams may surface of doors that will not open, or of crowded rooms where she remains unseen. Life circumstances may repeat old patterns, another rejection, another disappointment, until the truth of the fracture can no longer be ignored. This is the first turning point on the path of individuation. The ego, eager to maintain comfort, would rather avoid. But the unconscious insists. It whispers through loneliness, look deeper. These first fractures are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of the descent, the beginning of the meeting with shadow, which waits patiently in the silence. What society calls failure is in truth the opening of an inner chapter. Having no friends, though, painful reveals the place where old scars and new sensitivities meet. It is the stage where the unconscious sets its demand, no more hiding behind masks, no more running from wounds. The fracture is the invitation to begin. The first fractures of childhood, neglect, rejection, or conscious withdrawal leave behind a pattern. At first it feels protective. A quiet distance seems safer than risking exposure. But as the years unfold, the separation begins to weigh heavily. The outer mask, the persona, struggles to hide the tension inside. It shows a polite face, a calm voice, a facade of indifference, while deep beneath it, the shadow grows restless. Jung taught that what we repress does not vanish. Instead, it retreats into the unconscious and waits. The anger we never expressed, the envy, we never admitted the sadness, we never shared all of these, form the shadow. And when life grows quiet, when friends are absent, and distractions fade, the shadow steps forward. It speaks in loneliness, in dreams of crowded rooms where one remains invisible, in sudden bursts of emotion that feel out of proportion to the moment. The shadow does not come to destroy, but to be acknowledged. Yet the persona resists. The mask wants to remain intact to keep the appearance of stability. We may say, "I prefer solitude," when in truth the heart aches for connection. We may act content while carrying a silent hunger for understanding. This conflict between mask and truth creates deep exhaustion. For the energy spent in hiding is greater than the energy spent in living. Consider how the world responds. Society praises the mask, the persona that looks composed and self-sufficient. To confess to loneliness feels shameful. To admit longing seems weak. So the mask tightens even as the shadow presses harder. This tension is often unbearable. Without friends, without the constant noise of external approval, the mask loses its anchor. The unconscious uses this very emptiness to stage a confrontation. This is why prolonged solitude feels both painful and necessary. Without it, the shadow remains buried, drowned out by endless chatter. With it, the repressed begins to surface. Old grief rises. Forgotten desires stir. Fear reveals itself in the silence. We may not want to see these parts of ourselves, but they demand recognition. In Jung's words, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Loneliness, in this sense, removes the blindfold and forces us to see. The shadow is not only negative emotions, it is also lost potential. A talent suppressed because it did not fit the family mold. A dream denied because it threatened rejection. A truth silenced because it disrupted the persona's image. Without friends, without a stage to perform, upon these neglected parts return. They knock on the door of awareness, asking to be let in. The conflict between persona and shadow is the very heart of the struggle. The persona wants approval to appear acceptable in the eyes of others. The shadow holds the truths that approval could not tolerate. One part says, "Smile, stay quiet, be agreeable." The other whispers, "I am angry. I am hurt. I am more than this role." When the two collide, the person feels torn in half. This is why the absence of friendships can feel like an unbearable mirror. There is no one left to perform, for no audience to validate the mask. The silence reveals the performance itself. What once looked like strength is exposed as armor. What once passed as independence is unmasked as avoidance. The shadow has used solitude as its stage. Yet here lies the paradox. The shadow we fear is also the shadow we need. Without facing it, we remain shallow. Our friendships, if they exist, are built upon masks. We are liked for what we show, not for what we are. But once the shadow is seen, acknowledged, and slowly integrated, something new becomes possible. The person begins to show up without disguise. Relationships become fewer but truer, less about roles and more about essence. The confrontation, however, is rarely gentle. Loneliness strips away distractions, and the inner voices grow louder. Some nights they echo with guilt, anger, or regret. Other times they whisper with longing or with grief for years lost. To sit with this storm is painful. But it is also the moment when individuation begins, to see both persona and shadow, and to recognize that the self is larger than either one is the first movement toward wholeness. This is why solitude so often precedes transformation. When the crowd falls away, the unconscious has its chance. The shadow becomes visible. The persona begins to crack. And though the ego resists, the deeper self knows only by letting the mask fall can the truth emerge. This is not failure. It is initiation. The fracture of loneliness has now revealed its deeper purpose. It is not only about wounds or sensitivities, but about the inner confrontation that cannot be avoided forever. The shadow rises. The persona falters. And in this conflict, the possibility of awakening is born. When the mask cracks and the shadow steps forward, the experience is rarely comfortable. Yet within the very discomfort lies the seed of change. Loneliness that once felt like punishment begins to take on another form. It becomes a teacher, an initiation that strips away illusions and prepares the soul for something deeper. What looked like absence now reveals itself as an opening. Across cultures and throughout history, myths carry the same pattern. The hero is sent into exile. The wanderer enters the desert. The sage retreats into the cave. Each figure is removed from society before discovering an inner light. These images remind us that solitude is not always a sign of weakness. Often, it is a stage the soul requires before rebirth. To be without friends, without noise, is to walk into this symbolic wilderness. The awakening begins here in the recognition that loneliness is not simply emptiness, but a rite of passage. Painful emotions surface, but each one holds meaning. Anger becomes a call for justice. Sadness points toward the need for self-love. Envy reveals hidden potential waiting to be expressed. Even fear, though heavy, shows the exact territory where inner growth is needed. In this way, what once seemed unbearable becomes the map of transformation. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, of reconciling the opposites within the psyche. Loneliness pushes us into this process, whether we are ready or not. With no audience left to perform for, we are forced to see the unlived life within us. We come face to face with the fragments of ourselves we once denied. And in this confrontation, the possibility of integration begins. This is why isolation often precedes authenticity. When the old roles no longer hold, when the persona cannot protect us, the deeper self starts to emerge. We discover qualities long hidden: creativity, wisdom, sensitivity, courage. These strengths rise not because we sought them directly, but because the silence finally made room for them. Loneliness, then, is not the destruction of self, but the clearing away of debris so the true self can breathe. Awakening also changes how we see relationships. Before, bonds may have been formed out of fear: fear of being alone, fear of rejection, fear of not belonging. But through solitude, we learn that we can carry ourselves. We find we can sit with our own company and endure the silence. From this strength, relationships no longer need to fill a void. They become a sharing of abundance rather than a desperate attempt to cover lack. The transition, however, is not immediate. Like the mythical night journey, awakening first feels like darkness. The unconscious pulls us inward, asking us to abandon the false lights of distraction. It demands trust, a willingness to walk without certainty. Yet slowly, the dark reveals its secret. Beneath the silence, there is a spark, a quiet presence that whispers you are more than your loneliness. You are not abandoned, but invited. This invitation is toward authenticity. The soul calls us to shed what is false, to live without masks, to honor what truly matters. In this sense, loneliness is less about losing friends and more about losing illusions. It teaches us to stop chasing what does not nourish and to turn toward what sustains. We begin to see that what we once called weakness may actually be the foundation of inner freedom. Spiritual traditions have long understood this. The desert fathers, the wandering prophets, the meditating sages all stepped away from the crowd before stepping into truth. The pattern repeats: silence before revelation, solitude before wholeness. Jung recognized this archetypal rhythm and placed it at the center of individuation. The soul must descend before it can rise. The self must encounter its shadow. before it can claim its light. Awakening does not erase loneliness, but it changes its meaning. Instead of seeing it as punishment, we recognize it as preparation. Instead of resisting, we begin to listen. The silence once feared becomes sacred. The shadow once denied becomes integrated, and the self once fragmented begins to grow whole. This is the hidden purpose behind the painful season of having no friends. At this stage, the person starts to sense that what matters most is not the number of companions, but the depth of alignment with their own soul. Inwardly, something shifts. The wound is no longer just a wound, it is a doorway. The silence is no longer just emptiness, it is an altar. Through this reframe, loneliness is transformed from curse into initiation, and the journey toward individuation moves forward. Awakening is not the end of struggle. It does not mean that life suddenly becomes easy or relationships automatically deepen, but it marks the turning point. What was once endured blindly now carries meaning. What was once a burden now feels like a passage. The person who accepts this truth walks no longer as a victim of solitude, but as a participant in the unfolding of their own wholeness. Awakening begins as an inner recognition, but it does not remain only within. At some point, the realization must take form in life. The person who has faced solitude and shadow now stands at a crossroads. She can return to old patterns, seeking relationships to cover wounds, or she can choose a new path rooted in authenticity. This choice is the turning point, where transformation shifts from inner awareness to outward action. To choose oneself does not mean rejecting others forever. It means no longer accepting bonds that are false. It means refusing the company of those who only mirror superficial roles while making space for relationships that honor truth. Jung wrote that the self seeks wholeness, not conformity, and so the new path requires boundaries. Clear, steady lines drawn not out of anger, but out of respect for what has been discovered in silence. Boundaries begin simply. A refusal to engage in conversations that strip away dignity. A quiet step back from social ties that feed only emptiness. A willingness to endure solitude rather than accept a hollow bond. Each boundary is a statement the self will no longer trade authenticity for approval. What once was tolerated in the hunger for belonging is now declined in the service of truth. This is not an easy stance to hold. Society praises connection at any cost. To walk away from shallow company often invites judgment, whispers of coldness or pride. But for the one who has faced her shadow, these judgments no longer carry the same weight. She knows the cost of living behind a mask. She has learned through loneliness that peace is found not in numbers, but in depth. In this stage, silence becomes an ally rather than a tormentor. She no longer fills every gap with distraction. Instead, she learns to listen to the voice of her own being. And when she does speak, her words carry the strength of inner alignment. The mask has fallen, and what replaces it is not aggression, but clarity. Relationships now flow from a different center, not from fear, but from freedom. This act of boundary setting mirrors ancient rites of passage. Just as a hero slays the dragon to claim the treasure, so too must the individual confront the patterns that once held them captive. The dragon in this case is not another person, but the compulsion to seek validation outside the self. By setting boundaries, the person reclaims her inner authority. She declares that her worth does not depend on being chosen, but on choosing from within. The transformation also changes what kind of people appear in life. No longer drawn to the crowd that distracts, she now attracts those who resonate with authenticity. Shallow bonds dissolve, making room for encounters that nourish. These new relationships may be fewer, but they are marked by honesty and mutual growth. They reflect not the mask, but the essence. The unconscious has guided her into a circle where the soul can finally breathe. Boundaries, then, are not barriers against love. They are the conditions that make love possible. For without them, relationships collapse into dependency, performance, or avoidance. With them, bonds arise from choice, not compulsion. The person who has endured the silence of solitude now knows it is better to walk alone in truth than together in falsehood. And paradoxically, from this solitude springs companionship of a deeper kind. This shift is visible in subtle ways. She no longer says yes when her heart means no. She no longer tolerates disrespect disguised as closeness. She no longer allows her time and energy to be consumed by those who do not see her essence. Each no spoken with calm strength clears a path for a truer yes when the right connection appears. The inner compass has changed. Before, decisions were shaped by fear, fear of being left out, fear of being unseen. Now they are shaped by clarity. The person no longer asks, "Will they accept me?" but instead, "Does this align with my truth?" This is the essence of individuation, to live from the center of the self rather than from borrowed expectations. Such transformation is not loud. It does not announce itself in dramatic gestures. It appears in the steady refusal to betray one's inner voice. It appears in the courage to sit in solitude without despair. It appears in the quiet confidence that genuine bonds will come in their own time without force. This is the dignity that arises when shadow and persona are reconciled, when authenticity takes its rightful place. What begins as loneliness ends here as choice. A conscious decision to honor the self, to protect its truth, and to welcome only what supports its growth. This is not bitterness, but maturity. It is the recognition that to be whole is more important than to be surrounded. And from this recognition, life slowly reshapes itself. The person who embraces this transformation discovers a new kind of freedom. She is no longer bound to chase after affection, nor to prove her value through endless performance. She carries herself with quiet strength, knowing that her worth is not given by others, but revealed through her own being. Boundaries are no longer walls, but the natural expression of this freedom. This is the outward act of individuation to live in alignment with what the soul has revealed. The world may still misunderstand, but the self no longer bends under its weight. The loneliness that once crushed has become a foundation. Upon it, new life can be built. This is the power of choosing authenticity over illusion, of setting boundaries that honor the truth discovered in solitude. Loneliness is often misunderstood as a sentence, a condition imposed by fate without meaning. Yet, As we have seen, it carries a different face when approached with depth. What appears as lack is in truth a turning of the soul. When the noise of constant company falls away, what remains is the most important companionship of all, the bond with the self. The absence of friends does not diminish a person's worth. It reveals the point where the outer life and the inner life no longer match. This tension may feel painful, but it is also the doorway through which transformation begins. Each season of solitude is not random, but part of a larger rhythm of growth. Just as nature moves through winter before spring, the psyche moves through silence before renewal. At first, this silence feels heavy. The persona resists. The shadow emerges with emotions long buried: anger, grief, envy, fear. Yet within each feeling lies a seed of meaning. Anger points to boundaries, sadness to the need for compassion, envy to hidden potential, and fear to the field where courage is required. To face these truths is difficult, but it is the only path toward wholeness. Through this descent, a reframe slowly arises. Loneliness ceases to be a void and becomes a stage of initiation. Myths across cultures remind us of this pattern. The hermit with his lamp, the hero in exile, the wanderer in the desert, all show the same truth. Separation prepares the ground for revelation. When the familiar has fallen away, the eternal becomes visible. From this awakening comes choice. The person no longer accepts false belonging or shallow ties. She learns to draw boundaries not from anger, but from clarity. She chooses solitude over pretenses, authenticity over performance. And in that choice, her life changes. The bonds that arise from this new center are fewer, but they are real. They are no longer sought out of need, but invited out of abundance. Here lies the paradox of individuation. By turning inward, we discover a new capacity to connect outwardly. By befriending ourselves, we create the foundation for true friendship with others. Once the shadow is faced and integrated, the persona no longer has to carry the weight of performance. Relationships can finally be honest, rooted in essence rather than masks. This is the deeper lesson. Loneliness was never punishment. It was preparation. The absence of friends was the psyche's way of clearing a space where authenticity could be born. What once felt like exile now appears as incubation. The soul required silence so that the self could speak. And when the self is found, companionship no longer feels like a necessity for survival, but a gift freely given and freely received. To have no friends, then, is not the end of the story. It is a threshold. Beyond it lies a life guided less by fear and more by inner truth. Beyond it lies freedom from dependence on approval. Beyond it lies the ability to walk into or out of connection without losing oneself. In this way, solitude teaches us the highest form of love, the love that begins within and radiates outward. Jung once observed that individuation does not happen in crowds, but in the quiet gathering of the self. The soul requires silence to reveal what is eternal. And when we learn to rest in that silence, we realize we were never fully alone. There was always something greater present, a source of meaning, an unshakable center that carries us through every absence. So let us carry this truth gently. To find yourself without friends may sting, but it may also be your soul's way of calling you inward. It may be asking you to drop the masks to honor your truth and to prepare for the kind of connections that are authentic, enduring, and alive. And when those connections come, they will be different. They will not be formed out of fear, but out of freedom. They will not demand that you hide your shadow, but will welcome you in wholeness. Such bonds are rare, but they are worth waiting for. They mark the moment when loneliness has done its work and prepared the heart for love that is true. In the end, solitude teaches the most profound lesson of all. What looked like absence was always presence. The presence of your own soul, waiting patiently beneath the noise. The presence of strength discovered in silence. The presence of meaning that no external crowd can ever replace. So, if you find yourself in such a season, let it not be cause for despair. Let it be the sign that your life is shifting toward greater authenticity. The absence of friends is not emptiness. It is the clearing of space for what is real to grow. Before we close, I would invite you to pause and reflect. What did this exploration awaken in you? Have you known the weight of loneliness, and have you also glimpsed its hidden gift? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if these reflections speak to you, consider joining this space again by liking and subscribing. For now, let us rest in the closing thought: the soul's silence is never empty. It is the beginning of your truest presence.